Hello and welcome to the Schola Progenium. May I start this video by saying praise the Emperor. Praise the Emperor indeed this fine day, because today is the day that Games Workshop have released the rules for strategic reserves. It's something they've teased at, it's something they've hinted at since the first video over a month ago when they first announced 9th edition, but finally it's here and it looks great for the Blood Angels, and just in general looks great. Now, they've also released today a faction focused on Astra Militarum, and that actually has the updated rules for battle shock, so to speak, for combat losses, combat attrition. And that is something that's really important to us, and it's looking interesting and good, strong. From a Blood Angels perspective, it should help us hack through hordes of melee when we're outnumbered, hordes of infantry when we're outnumbered. But from a horde perspective, it could also be considered a good thing when they take huge losses. It won't finish the unit off anymore. All in all, it's a little give and a little take from that side of things. Now, of course, since the last video, the rules on dense terrain have been released, and there's been some controversy online regarding that. But I'm not really going to go into that today because, for me, 9th edition is shaping up to look excellent, and the rule, although for dense terrain, although it is hefty and kind of a lot of words and hard to get your head around, once you get the hang of it, for me at least, in my opinion, it's quite clear and quite specific in what it wants you to do. For me, it looks like a good rule. It's just a rule that's going to be added in 9th edition. It doesn't really make me feel like it impacts the Blood Angels to a degree where I need to discuss it in detail. But the other two aspects I'm going to break down in a much more depth, and let's get stuck into that right away. So with the tactical reserves, the first thing that we see is that it says that it doesn't affect terminators, or rather, you don't have to pay command points to put things like terminators in reserve, or Genestealer Cult, or anything that is placed somewhere else on the battlefield with a special rule. Now, I double checked before I made this video, and this does indeed include our jump pack infantry, which means that our jump pack infantry can go into reserve for free, which is great news, because I was thinking, are we going to have to spend CP? How many CP is it going to cost us to keep our Death Company and Sanguinius Guard in reserve, if we have to deep strike them in, and this kind of thing. But that is not the case, and glory to the Emperor is that good news, because not only is it a relief, but it gives us a huge advantage. Because look at the way the game is turning out for 9th edition. It's about that assault, it's about that punchy back and forth, punch and counter punch. You'll get into their lines, they'll deploy some stuff, try and counterattack you and that kind of thing. But if they want to out-strategic reserve the Blood Angels, they're going to be at a massive disadvantage. They're going to have to invest a lot of CP in that. Because everyone starts with the same amount of CP, you are guaranteed to have the same as them when you start. But if you pay a few extra points for your jump pack, something you would do anyway, you can deep strike in, you can deploy 9 inches away from the enemy, which is the same for strategic reserves. Unless they're in your deployment zone, you have to be more than 9 inches away when you've deployed the unit. But with your jump packs, you are saving that CP. You are more flexible when the game starts. So when you're writing your list, you make that decision to include jetpack units, and you come to the game, and you now have a more flexible list, even though you've had less points to spend on maybe having a few more units because you've invested in jetpacks on the units that you've got. But although you have maybe one less unit or something in total, jetpacks are quite cheap indeed at the moment. The advantage in the game, once you actually deploy and once you set up and once you need to start striking on the battlefield with your reserves, which is going to be a big part of 9th edition, and that's just going to play hugely into our hands. Think about it not only from an attacking perspective, where if they want to counterpunch you, every unit that they keep off the board ready to counterpunch you, that is safe from your long range support fire, that's going to cost them a CP to do that. But if you want to just have a unit off the board ready to come onto if you want to throw most of your units forward and not really defend your own lines, maybe just holding objectives, rack up points, or depending on the situation. But if you want to keep a heavy defensive unit, say a Furioso Dreadnought or something like that, that's a really useful unit. If they drop in something powerful, that Furioso, Blood Talons or Blood Claws, either one, it has the ability to certainly reroll wounds. And one format is reroll hits and reroll wounds against the enemy. You're going to be wounding almost anything on 2s with that crazy double strength or plus strength, depending on which option you take. But either way, it's going to take you above strength 10, so you can easily be wounding almost anything you'll face on 2s, and you'll tear stuff apart. And there's plenty of cheap units in the Blood Angels Codex that you can spend barely any points on and just drop 1 CP on, or 2 CP to have a couple of them. And have them in your back pocket. They're barely costing you anything. They're not losing you the game because you're lacking massively in points. They barely impact your list, but it allows you to throw your entire might into your assault. And when the opponent tries to come into your back lines and take on your few back defensive units, you can just bring on this reserve unit. It's not cost you much. It's not cost you much CP. Cost them a load of CP because they've not only had to counterpunch and defend you, they've also brought this unit onto your back lines. If they're even going to do that, if you imagine you're going to be bringing Death Company, Sanguinary Guard, we know how it is with Blood Angels. The opponent has to bring everything they've got to blunt that charge. So are they really going to have the CP or even the units spare to actually affect our back lines? It's really good from a defensive perspective, because we can totally outplay the reserve situation. It's just phenomenal for us. It's absolutely fantastic. Yes, it gives the ability for people to strike into our back lines, but we can just win that game every time, or 9 times out of 10. So, just absolutely phenomenal. Absolutely out of this world. Really good rule for us so far. Now, it gets even more interesting when we look, something I should cover more than anything is the CP cost. Now, they've decided, it says here that they're doing it based on power rating of units. So they're bringing power rating in to matched play, and power level into matched play. Now, if it stays as it currently stands, a Bile Predator is 8. So as you can see, and I'll put the thing up on the screen, it's 1 to 9 power level of units costs you 1 CP, 10 to 19 costs you 2, 20 to 29 costs you 3, and so on and so forth in increments of 10. So, although it's quite cheap to pop 1 or 2 units in the back, it actually quickly eats into your CP to put any high proportion of units in defense and reserve. So that really does reinforce the point that because we just have the flexibility where we can put so many units into reserve at an absolute 0 CP cost, because that's what our army is all about. We can, the opponent just to counter that assault with a couple of counter reserve units, it's only going to cost them a couple of CP, that's fine. But if they want to really crush the assault and get into our back line, it's going to cost them a load of CP, and they'll have a load of units off the board as well, which means there's less for us to assault in the first place. So, and there's just more. It gets even better for Blood Angels from this perspective, because because those jump packs allow us to reposition at a much greater flexibility and a much faster rate if it takes a couple of turns. So if an opponent brings in a heavy Bulgrin unit from the side, to crush into a Dorado Dreadnought or Leviathan Dreadnought or whatever, and they decide to bring some heavy units in to really mob and weigh down part of an area of our deployment zone, let's say if they come in the third turn, that's going to be bad in that area, but they're really only going to be able to affect that area. It's already turned 3 if they've come in on your deployment zone. I'll get into that in a second. But, they've only got a couple of turns to reposition, and if they only move 5 or 6 inches a turn with a couple of charges in there, they're never going to make it more than halfway across the battlefield before the end of the game. Whereas if you bring a unit with jetpacks in, you can assault 9, you bring them in, assault them 9 inches, and then from that point you can move them 12 and get off another 9-inch charge, or however you feel. You're moving 20 inches easily, minimum, or sort of on average 20 inches easily with any of those jump pack units. You can reposition on this smaller board that is just magnified in effect. So that idea of repositioning our forces and reconcentrating our forces is just going to be hugely impactful. Because it means the CP that the opponent spends on putting these units in reserve is much less flexible than almost if they had them on the board, which means again it just plays more into our hands, because if they bring them in and they waste a couple of turns not using them, and then they commit them to one flank or another flank, or one edge of the board, we can pull units over to there very rapidly in a turn, deal with that threat, and then reposition again by the end of the game onto objectives and grab more objectives and get more points. So it's get to other areas of the battlefield and crush other units. So it's just really, really easy for us to counter it with units that are already on the field. And I think the point of this in the game is that you counter it with your units that are off the field. So it's like playing, as I said, it's like playing trap cards or instant cards. If you're playing like magic cards or Yu-Gi-Oh. As I said, I don't play that game, but the principle's there. It's like, aha, bam, I've got this, and then your opponent next turn goes, aha, bam, I've got this, and they throw that down. It's that counterpunch and counterpunch. But with us, we don't have to be, aha, with our reserve units. We can keep them for when we really need them, because a lot of the time we will have units on the field that can just reposition and do the job for us. So we can keep very few units in our aha pile and get most of our units doing what they need to do on the battlefield, overwhelming the enemy, and just keep something in our back pocket nice and cheap to come on and defend our own backlines if we really need it, if the opponent gets to the point where they can actually threaten our backlines with their own tactical reserves. Although that, as I've explained, seems very unlikely, and if they commit to that, they'll have very few CP. So, really interesting the fact that they're bringing the power rating in. I think it's an interesting move from Games Workshop, from just to sort of, if I were to philosophize on the situation, because it allows them to sort of tweak the value of units on two levels. Because, say for example, Knight costs, under 29 CP as a general rule. I think the Gallant's around 23 CP off the top of my head. And I have a Chaos Knight Legion and an Imperial Knight Legion. But I was tempted to go into the lore on them all then, but I'm not going to. But essentially, a Knight Gallant just off the field that could come in your deployment zone turn 3 for just 3 CP. Just march on the field and just start smashing stuff up. And because Knights because you can only really focus one at a time, and you really need to focus one at a time until you get them down to their last bracket, and then they're not very dangerous and you can move on to the next one if you deem the first one safe. But with Knights, it's very viable for them to not have to need a close combat Knight until the second turn. So they can just bring it on anywhere up to your deployment zone edge turn 2, or anywhere including your deployment zone but just not your back line turn 3. That Gallant, it would have been shot at. It's just interesting, because I guess what I'm trying to say is, when you look at the power level and you compare it to points and you compare it to CP that it costs, and you've got these sort of 3 different resources and 3 different values, bouncing against each other. How much CP does it cost to put one of these things off the board? What sort of juice can you get out of it? What's the best value units to get out of reserve? It's just a whole nother resource you need to manage, and a whole other balancing act. And it's just, I can't even begin to predict. There's so much variety of units in 40k. I cannot even begin to predict what the options will be. But the prospect of a Valiant Knight turn 2 just appearing at the edge of your deployment zone, having not taken a shot at all, 28 wounds, it's got its harpoon in range, it's got its flamestorm cannon in range, it's got its melters in range, it's not taking a wound, and it's just ready to crack on, and you've been busy shooting away at like a couple of Gallants that they've started on the field, if that makes sense. and run forward with, and you've had to shoot those gallants because the big bad is off and it's only cost them 3 CP. And knights now start with 12 CP, so those knight players are like, right, fine, I'll start with 9, run something on the board turn 3 that's just going to absolutely wreck the opponent. It's going to be very nasty as a mechanic, and it's going to be very interesting, and there are a lot of armies out there which are going to be able to make a lot of use of this. And if you don't have, I wasn't feeling that bad for Tau. I was feeling quite bad for Imperial Guard, but I wasn't feeling that bad for Tau yet. Because I thought, more will be revealed on Overwatch, and they can, do their Tau thing with the Overwatch and all of that. But now, it's probably starting to get quite scary, because if you've got absolutely no units that can really make use of melee, and, Crute, wow, I have like 45 Crute or something in my collection of Tau, and I just basically never use them because they're just too easy to shoot up. Maybe those Crute spam in Forest will be interesting. I don't want to get sidetracked, but, there's just, this opens up such a huge variety, having power level in play. For example, Assault Marines and Death Company, I believe, are both 5 power level for 5 guys, and an additional 5 power level for an additional 5. So, the 15 Assault Marines versus 15 Death Company running on the side of the field. What you're going to pick, there's just a huge difference in value there in terms of the thing you're bringing on the field. But likewise, the more value you have off the field in terms of the power level, sort of juice you squeeze, the more points you will have off the field, which means the less points you have on the field. So arguably, it could be better to have those Assault Marines there. Yeah, power level wise, you're not getting most bang for your buck for your CP that you spent. You only need a unit that can come in and hack stuff apart turn 3, and you want to hold them off till turn 3. And you don't want to be without loads of points till turn 3 when you've already got stuff deep striking and all that kind of thing. So in that case, just run them on turn 3 in the enemy, anywhere on the sides, anywhere basically apart from the back line, and start running in and hacking stuff up. And if you can move your banners around, reposition your banner, it's just so useful for sort of hammer and anvils, where we can have, and think about, just so, I better describe the rest of the rules before I go any further. So the next part of the rules is this. Battle round 2, they have to be set up wholly within 6 inches of any battlefield edge. So not the enemy battlefield edge or in their deployment zone. So you've got, 3 feet on the sides. So just, basically, if you don't have a fast army, you can get them on the sides as far up the board as if you had a fast army that can just sprint and assault and has kinds of movement tricks. So, just good for that. And if you've got heavy hitting units that aren't that fast, but you want to get them into combat, you can just bring them in on the side. So, loads of units will be able to make use of that. On battle round 3, you can set them up wholly within 6 inches of any battlefield edge apart from the enemy battlefield edge. So not their back line, but anywhere else. So you can run stuff on the sides, on the flanks, within the enemy deployment zone in turn 3, which is absolutely huge. And it's interesting because not Smash captains, but other captains will be useful. So, for example, I'll probably have a lot of use. I have a captain called Captain Atreides. He's got dual lightning claws and Terminator armor, and he's been in a couple of battle reports, and he always makes a great show of himself. And having him with my sort of backline shooters, because you need a bit of artillery support, as I've said, he will give loads of buffs. And if anyone tries any funny business with tactical reserves, he's just there with his lightning claws ready to dice people up. And that's the same, you just have, and then you have another unit maybe you've spent a CP on, or you'll have a lieutenant with a power fist, something cheap, ready to pop open any heavy armor that comes on the backfield. And with it's always been a choice for us that with our buff characters, we kind of have to move them away from one section because we move around the board so much. Some of our units go without buffs instead of other factions that can just, always concentrate their buffs in one area because their army works as one solid unit. But now, we'll have the ability to sort of, there'll be more value in taking a couple of cheaper characters, which again means maybe taking more battalions or more, different detachments and that kind of thing. So there's just so many resources to manage now. As you can pick up, there's just so many factors coming into play. what do it's how many points do you spend on your backlines, how many points do you spend on buffs for those, and how good do you make the characters. Are they going to be, you don't want to spend so many points on them in case they never have to get into combat, but you want to make them good enough that if someone comes in your back lines, they can defend the units that they're buffing. Maybe you just have one, as I said, a Furioso. I like Furioso, so that's the one that's coming to mind, but obviously you've got a million units to choose from. Just there ready to run on and defend those cannons just in case you need them, or defend those tanks, when the time comes, just in case you need them. And if not, and it gets to turn 3, and clearly the opponent is not going to be bringing anything into your back lines, they've committed their reserves to defending their own, you can just march that Furioso and start hacking stuff up from their deployment zone, just bring it into the battle. And yeah, you won't be able to redeploy it that quickly, but, let's say that Furioso was actually, something that can move fast, like bikes with firepower, or, there's just a million options now. And that brings me on to the sort of next big thing about this, which is bringing on mobile firepower support to support directly our assault troops. So it's all well and good having an artillery duel, and you shoot your heavy support, they shoot their heavy support, and you try and crack them open, or try and reduce the units that are a threat to your assault infantry when the time comes for the big assault. But unfortunately, one of the problems with that is often, our assault infantry are actually good at cracking open tanks. So you kind of want to shoot their specialist stuff, and then inevitably your tanks all get wiped out because you're shooting their specialist stuff, and clearing screens and that kind of thing. You're doing jobs that need to be done pre-assault. You're preparing the assault, but because you've got those jobs to do, your tanks get picked off because they're not just focused everything on a tank versus tank, or heavy support versus heavy support duel. And that's just a problem for Blood Angels, because we've got jobs to do. We have to clear those screens. We have to do other things with our long-range firepower. And there's no choice in that matter if we want our assault to come off. But if you don't have to clear those counter-assault units and, those specialist troops that are going to be dangerous, the units with the plasma weapons and that kind of thing, the Redemptor Dreadnought, this, that, and the other, if you don't have to clear that stuff pre-game, you can either take less heavy support and have more in your assault units, you can push more up the field, or you can focus your heavy support on the duel and potentially win it, or at least, do work, which means you have less big stuff to kill with your assault troops on the battlefield. So it gives us a massive amount of flexibility, and we can do that now by bringing our fire support with us. So let's say, for example, you had a unit of aggressors, or a unit of those Primaris that all have the plasma rifles, like Destructors or something they're called, I can't remember. Or, you've got a unit of, or you've got a Baal Predator, for example, which is, costs 1 CP to put off the board. And you've got him, and you think, right, normally he'd get cracked open. He's no anti-tank, but he is a tank, so he usually just gets wasted. He can't take part in the heavy duel, because he's designed for bullying infantry and, DACA support. Well, if you bring him on, if you keep him off the board turn 1 and keep him safe, and then bring him on turn 2 or turn 3, depending on what you need, turn 2, he can come in, and you can start assaulting, and then you can shoot, or you can turn 2, you can start assaulting stuff and chewing stuff up, and then you can shoot down any things you can't get to with the assault, with the vehicle that's been safe up to that point, and now it's there, up close and ready to fire. And with the narrow board, a Baal coming in can essentially, with 24-inch ranged assault cannons, cover almost to the halfway line, to the midfield, and deep into their lines. And with this, if you've got heavy bolts on the side as well, you can go even further. You can cross the board with 36-inch range if you've got a smaller board size. So because of that, your Baal can come in, and anything you can't get to because of an enemy screening, your Baal can shoot up, so you're not going to just get chewed up in the opponent's turn. And they have to rely on those counter reserves. Likewise, if they bring those counter reserves on, and those counter reserves are vulnerable to heavy firepower, you can march your heavy firepower on that flank and shoot them up and kill them. So it brings a massive value to us having some real heavy firepower, but some specialist firepower that can come on from reserve and support with close fire support our assault troops, so they can bring that fire support with them, which is just going to be absolutely phenomenal. It's just going to be so useful to us. Imagine just being able to, imagine just being able to, okay, yeah, you're not getting the most use out of them for the first turn, but marching a unit of aggressors on and shooting up the stuff that your death company can't get to, or coming in and just clearing that screen and getting that job done. So you're turn 2 with that thing coming on, just in local fire support, clearing off all those screens, and then those death companies just have a straight charge in when they deep strike. It's just, as I sort of predicted, having a hammer and anvil where you have something come on the board and something moving up the board, or something deep striking in. It's really, with the rules as they are written, it's going to be really, really effective. Now, strategic units always count as having moved this turn, so you can't move once you come on, so you've just got that 6-inch movement, so to speak. And they can't make an advance or fall back in the turn they come in. Any strategic reserve unit not set up on the battlefield by the end of the battle counts as destroyed. So you can bring units in at any point on the game. You can just march unit scouts on turn 5 and just grab that objective. You can do whatever you need to do. So it's going to be huge, but remember, the opponent is going to have to spend CP on their cunning tricks and their counter punches, whereas our punches come to us for free, which means we only have to spend a couple of CP on the cunning tricks, such as marching stuff on late game, just having a few points in the bank, having a card up your sleeve, having a reserve unit in your back pocket for emergencies. We have so much less CP investment in this clearly vital tactic that we can either go all in and spend as much CP as the opponent and really rock it, or just have more CP to do what we need to do. As I've said, since Blood of Baal, we have some ridiculously powerful pound-for-pound stratagems in our codex. Now, so it essentially says also that, from the look of things, there's no upper limit to the amount of units you can have off the board. So I don't know how that's going to come into tabling and how they're going to... I think they're going to bring tabling back in, because it says, you can leave yourself, open to destruction if you leave your units off the board. It mentions that in the article. Other units may find themselves heavily outnumbered at the start of the battle. That's what they say in the article. So that presumably leads to something terrible. But essentially means it's open to you. You can have and open to your opponent. You can spend as much CP as you want, have as many units off the board as you want, and you can bring them in as late as you want in the game. And that's just that. So, that just seems, it's open season on strategic reserves. This is clearly a hugely important tactic in 9th edition. And as I've said several times, we are the masters of this, and we will have so many more units coming in when we need, where we need them, and have those CP spare. So just for very few points on jump packs. Will jump packs go up in points? Potentially, who knows? Now, there's so much depth to that, and there's loads we'll discover as we play games, but that's really sort of, from my viewpoint, what I'm excited about. Excuse me. It also says, essentially they can't come in within 9 inches unless they're in your deployment zone, in which case they can come in within an inch, and they can even come in assault. But I wouldn't really do that, unless you've got a unit that can't shoot. I'd come in, shoot, and then assault. So, really, really powerful. Now, we asked the question last week, or, a few days ago, is 9th edition the edition of melee? And I think, undeniably, it is the edition of, at least, in-your-face, gritty, close quarters fighting. Even if you're shooting point blank or you're assaulting, it's going to be brutal and crazy, and stuff's going to be going off everywhere. And that's our whole thing. That's what we do. So the final thing I need to discuss today is the other rules which came out in the Astra Militarum faction focus. Now, obviously, we're not bothered about Astra Militarum stratagems or anything like that. If you want to check that out, go to my brother's channel, Mordian Glory, and I'll leave a link in below, but he's covers everything to do with Guard and has done for years, loads of battle reports, loads of tactics, and he's covering all of these releases from a Guard perspective. So if you're a Guard player and you're listening to this video, definitely go check that out. But the thing that matters to us is combat attrition. Now it says that in combat attrition, it's basically the same. You roll a dice and add the number of models destroyed this turn. So if you lost 2 models, to close combat, and you roll a 4, that counts as 6. And also if you lost 2 in the shooting phase as well, it counts as 8. So you add it all together. An unmodified roll of a 1 is always a success, which is great because for big units, say for example you took 20 witches or 20 gene stealers or something like that, and you don't have fearless on them, and witches get fearless from I think turn 3 or something like that, maybe turn 4. Either way, a variety of these big units have a way of not getting absolutely massacred by leadership, it's true. But for the units that don't, it was always a risk that if they took sort of 10 casualties out of a 20 casualty unit, they couldn't avoid losing further. Even if they rolled a 1 plus 10 is 11, wipes out the rest of the unit, or minus their leadership save. Right? So it was always brutal. Once you took a certain amount of losses, you were screwed. But always having a successful 1 is absolutely fantastic. Now, I think that's just solidifying a change from a while. I haven't used big units in combat for a while. I never usually go over about 12, and so it's not. And I usually get, the Death Company either take few losses or get wiped out. So it's not a rule I use that often at the moment, but it's a good one where 1 is always a success. Now, if morale test exceeds units' leadership, 1 model flees and other models must take combat attrition tests. Now, long story short, combat attrition is like when you are getting out of a vehicle that's been destroyed and you have to, transport. And everyone rolls a dice, and on a 1, they're dead. So, combat attrition, roll 1d6 for each remaining model in the unit. For each 1 additional model flees. So it's just the same as getting out of a blown up vehicle. If you fail, so let's say and if you fail your leadership, you only lose 1 model and then take combat attrition tests. So that's really key as well. So let's say you fail your leadership. You lost 5 and you roll a 6 and you re-roll it because no fear. And you get a 5, so it's 10, you fail your leadership, you only lose 1 guy instead of 2 if your leadership 8. So, it's a limit, but then it rolls over because every model in the unit must roll a dice, and on a 1, they flee as well. So it's interesting because there will be certain unit sizes which are best to take in the reflection of these rules. Because it goes on to say that you subtract 1 from the combat attrition test if the unit's below half strength, so it's 1s and 2s. So if you have a unit and you shoot it up and you charge in and you hack it up and it fails its leadership by a decent amount, it's going to lose 1 model for sure instead of loads of models. But then if it's below half strength, any other models run on a 1 or a 2. So it's it will be brutal, but they won't lose the full unit. They'll never just get wiped out, which is kind of interesting for us because sometimes, if they've only got 1, we either wipe them out as Blood Angels or we get them down to like a couple of models, in a close combat. Even if we're fighting huge elites, elite units like, Incubi or whatever, it's still going to be a lot of people dead by the end of the first round on both sides. And that means that if they've only got 1 or 2 left, then it's quite likely that they'll lose that 1 model. If they've only got 1 guy left, he's basically definitely going to run, unless he rolls a 1, which is always the same. But the bigger the unit, the more models are likely to be left at the end, which isn't too bad for us. You just got to hope if you've got 2 models left that the 1 model runs and the other model gets a 1 or a 2. But, it's annoying because it means that some of the time we are going to be trapped in combat by small units that otherwise we would have steamrolled. So this overall is probably a disadvantage to Blood Angels because of the momentum we rely on. So it's going to be really important to do the combined forces actions. So you're going to need that firepower. You can't just go, or you're going to need super hardcore melee, but you're going to need to rack up kills and be really wiping out units when you hit them in the assault and moving on to the next. Or, you know, making sure essentially that you get them to the point where you are going to kill them in their combat phase, or they're going to have to pull out or whatever. You know, you're just going to have to hit them hard. But really, is that anything different to how we normally play? I would say no, not at all. So for us, it's business as usual. And overall, I think, you know, however our enemies die, whether they flee or they die under our chainswords, either way, we're going to cut them down in melee in a couple of rounds of combat. So for us, not a massive deal. If we get stuck in combat for longer than that, then something's gone badly wrong on many other levels. So, you know, for us, just business as usual. Now, you know, that's really it, guys. It's extremely good news, extremely exciting, but I don't want to go on and on because I've dug deep into that. And I've covered a variety of aspects of it. So I'd just say to you, you know, what are you excited? What units do you think would be great to keep off on the back lines? What units do you think would be great to run on the edge of their deployment zone turn 2 and start firepower, start chopping? What units would be best for each job? What units, you know, I must admit, I'm pretty illiterate when it comes to power levels. I had to look up a couple of examples for this video, but I never use power levels because I always play match play. So if there are any of you out there who dabble in narrative and that kind of thing as well as match play, and you can give us some of the best value units for power level, you know, let us know. It looks to me like, you know, the more elite a unit, the better value it is in power level. But, you know, I've only browsed I've just skimmed a couple to make sure. So get involved with the discussion below. Let us know what units you think are going to make the most of this. Let us know how you're excited to use this, what units you're going to dust off, what units you have come in your backfield, what units you're going to come in from the side, and obviously we've got all our deep strike units on top of that as well. And what do you think of the morale? Is it a bad thing? Is it a good thing? Or does it not matter? You know, please do get in touch in the comment section below. So apart from that, you know, as usual, I hope you found this video interesting. I hope you found it entertaining and exciting. This has been the Schola Progenium. Thank you very much for your time. Goodbye.